see lots of people talk about it, digital transformation, but how do you actually make that real? Well, the way you do so is by adopting this paradigm, exceptions-based straight-through processing. Let me first talk about the more traditionally known piece of it, straight-through processing. What's meant by that is you simply assume when you're designing your process that every single step can be automated. Doesn't matter whether you consider that completely impossible today. Oh, there's no way we're ever going to be able to automate that step, and that's a brave statement with the level of innovation that's happening in technology. But even if you were utterly convinced it could never be automated, just put that away, park your skepticism, and assume that every step in the process can be automated. And where it can't, you put in place a manual queue, as shown in this diagram. Critically, the rest of the process behaves exactly the same, irrespective of whether this step was executed automatically or manual. In other words, it has absolutely no knowledge about whether the prior steps were automated or manual, or else you'll never achieve the outcome we're looking for here. And when it's manual, it simply goes through the process, drops into a manual queue, and somebody does just as they used to do in the old world. And then when they finish that, it continues on through the process. So to make that real for you, for example, when we were working in a bank back in 2011, automating their onboarding processes, at the time, there was no way to do real-time identity checking as required under the Australian Know Your Customer legislation. So we just put that into a manual queue, and the staff logged on to the external systems by a company called Vida here in Australia to do the identity check, just as they would have done before we put the tool in. About a year and a half later, a company came out with a automated identity checking service. We were able to plug that in into the service just there, and the rest of the process was without change. So that's the exceptions part, in other words. And in this case, we're talking about an exception where 100% of everything is an exception. Otherwise, there's no automation. But if I take that example I just talked about where we plugged in that third-party identity providing service, when we first did so, it was by no means perfect. In fact, we were only getting about 60 or 70% of the results. Now, in the old days, that might say, oh, we can't go live. We can't fix it because it doesn't cover everybody. Well, no. You just put in place an exceptions queue for the other 30% to fall into. So you get your 60 or 70% automation, and the rest is processed manually. Over time then, the identity provider improved their service, and at this point we're now up to 98.7%. But the other advantage of that exceptions queue, particularly if it's a service under your own control rather than an external service, is you start to see what are the exceptions and what's causing them. And you might find there's only one thing that's causing 10% to flow in there. Well, excellent. You've now got your next target to automate. And so it gives you a hit list of things you can work through to improve the level of automation. So this is a really important concept, particularly when it comes to this. People often say Agile is all about minimum viable product or MVP-based delivery. And again, an easy thing to say, but practically how do you do that? Well, this makes that concept very easy because I can go live with a service that only covers 70% and leave the other 30% in the manual queue and then start knocking them off, as I described to you earlier. And that enables you to get live really easily, quickly, and then address the 70 or 80%. The 80-20 rule tends to apply here, that 20% of the effort gets you 80% of the automation, and then the rest of the 80% is getting the last 20%. Well, you can get there quickly without having to worry about that last 80% of it. Final thing I'll say about this is, and it's particularly prevalent in the government sector, with some justification because of what they call in Australia the universal service obligation, but it also exists in the private sector, and it's what we call edge case obsession. We can't go live because we haven't dealt with the pensioner who's got 2 dogs who lives in the back of a remote town, and there's all this obsession about holding us off live till we've covered everybody. Well, this approach gets around that restriction because you're still meeting your universal service obligation. Everybody's still being dealt with. It's just that the easier cases are going to get automated more quickly than the other cases. So that's really it. That's the most important part of this feature, and do not underestimate it because by adopting this process management tool and critically this exceptions-based straight-through processing paradigm, you can deliver a major uplift to the customer experience while you're still dealing with the vagaries of the legacy systems that you have sitting below the integration layer.